powerful one for our country. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from some of the most outstanding historians of all time in our country. More will be said about them later. But the distinguished Democratic leader of the Senate and I are honored to be with each and every one of you. We will have the presentation from our historians. We will hear the testimonials of our members. And the leader has his testimonials on the floor of the Senate since they are in session. So we're honored that he came over to the House to be with us. He served in the House for 18 years. Only recently has he exceeded that amount of time in the United States Senate. But we still lay claim to him and take pride. Before I bring him on, though, I want to reflect, as we all do today, on the deadly assault that was waged on the Capitol and the Congress and the Constitution 1 year ago today. The insurrection was an assault not only on the building, but on the democracy itself, which that day was on the brink of catastrophe. Lynn Cheney told me something about George Bush. She said on the day of 9/11, when 9/11 first occurred, we just learned, he was in the White House. And he said, these terrorists may shake the foundations of our buildings, but they will not shake the foundations of our democracy. What he said then applied then, and it applies now. Because of the courage of our members, the support of the Capitol Police, the staff, the custodial staff, the insurrection failed. Democracy prevailed. Congress returned to the Capitol that same night to accomplish our purpose, to ensure the peaceful transfer of power. 1 year later, it is essential that we do not allow anyone to rewrite history or whitewash the gravity of what took place. It is our duty to find the facts of January 6th to ensure that such an assault on our democracy cannot happen again. And it is also our duty to establish and preserve the narrative of that day. And that is what we are doing today. 1 year later, I remain in awe of the courage of all of you, our members, not only on that day, but every day since, including now, as you share reflections and preserve the truth. Let me close by, as I have done throughout the day, by quoting President Lincoln. He said so many things that were so appropriate and quoted by our chaplain earlier today at the pro forma session when she quoted Lincoln's greatest speech, the second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity toward all. You know the rest. But imagine the magnanimity of it all, that the president would say that after the Civil War. In this regard, he said, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. We hold the power and bear the responsibility. Now, indeed, we have a responsibility as daunting and demanding as any previous generations of leadership. We hold the power and bear the responsibility to save our democracy. In that regard, it is now my honor to yield to the distinguished majority leader of the Senate, and speaking on behalf of our colleagues in the House, we welcome you back to the House side. And I want to thank the leader because he was so instrumental the night of the assault in ensuring that we would return to the Capitol and the world would see that the insurrection was defeated and victory had prevailed. Mr. Leader, Chuck Schumer.
Well, thank you, everybody, and it is good to be back here in the Cannon Caucus Room. It's been redone. I hardly recognized it, but like everything else, much in the House, under the Speaker's leadership, much improved. And I want to thank her for bringing us here together for this event, and of course, our wonderful guest speakers in today's moderated discussion. Now, we all know today is an important but sad day for all of us here at the Capitol, and indeed for our entire country. A year ago, a mob of radicals carried out for the first time in over 200 years an armed attack on the U.S. Capitol in an effort to undermine our constitutional order. History is clear. When democracies are in danger, it often starts with a mob. And that's why it's so wonderful that we're having our historians here today. We all know the mob can start out as a small number. Not everyone has to join it, but it just needs a critical mass of people who stay out of the way, who ignore it, or even condone those actions. And if it's allowed to grow, and leaders, irresponsible leaders, egg on the mob and encourage it, it can become poison to our democracy. And then the unthinkable becomes real. Democracy erodes and could, horror of horrors, and God forbid, vanish. But thankfully, that did not happen 1 year ago. Today, we pay tribute to all those who stared into the abyss to protect this building, our Capitol Police, our DC Metro Police, our National Guard. And we also thank the unsung heroes who came into this building hours after the attack to heal, repair, and make whole what the rioters tried to tear down. Our maintenance staff, our technicians, all those who came in late at night without complaint and brought the Capitol back to life. Above all, as we remember this day, we must also speak the truth about what happened a year ago, about the root causes of January 6th, its legacy, and what it portends to the future of our democracy. That's why conversations like the one today matter. It's an honor to join the speaker with Doris, Kearns, Goodwin, and John Meacham. Their works are some of the most authoritative accounts of American history in the public mind. And I also want to thank today's moderator, Dr. Carla Hayden, the president of the Library of Congress, who throughout her career has been one of the top library directors in the country. It's an honor. And finally, I want to thank my colleagues from both the House and Senate for sharing their stories. These stories are painful, but they radiate with the light of truth, and we must continue to shine that light upon them. So thank you for making that happen. And let's remember one more thing today. That powerful as the mob may seem at times, the counter is stronger. The wellspring of democracy runs deep. The strength of the American people is unshaken. And they've always stepped up in the end, Democrat, Republican, Independent, to preserve what has been handed down by the framers. I know we can do it again, and I want to thank you, each of us, in our small ways, for making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leader, for your very profound words and for your speech on the floor of the Senate today as well, sharing your experiences of that day. That's so important, and that's why we're very excited to hear the testimonials of our members following this moderated conversation. To begin the conversation, we're privileged to have a contribution from one of the great creative talents of our time, Lin Manuel Miranda. May his beautiful words be an inspiration to us. Among the words he said and in the music, we'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you and we'll give the world to you. Lin Manuel and his father and the Hamilton singers whom we'll hear from said that they were all very honored to be asked to participate today. I call your attention to
a new year brings hope for the future, new energy to face the tasks ahead of us, and a renewed promise to strengthen the foundations of our democracy. We are all stewards of the American experiment, working to pass down to our children and our grandchildren a more perfect union that treats all its citizens with fairness and equity. We should never take our rights and liberties for granted, and we must remain committed to finding a way forward together. That's what I wrote about in the song Dear Theodosia from Hamilton. I believe no challenge is worth abandoning our efforts to unite as Americans. We'll keep working, generation after generation, until we reach that someday.
Dear Theodosia, what to say to you? You have my eyes, you have your mother's name. When you came into the world, you cried, and it broke my heart. I'm dedicating every day to you. Domestic life was never quite my style. When you smile, you knock me out, I fall apart, and I thought I was so smart. You will come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. We'll give the world to you, and you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Yeah, you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Oh, Philip, when you smile, I am undone. My son, look at my son. Pride is not the word I'm looking for. There is so much more inside me now. Oh, Philip, you outshine the morning sun. My son, when you smile, I fall apart, and I thought I was so smart. My father wasn't around. My father wasn't around. I swear that I'll be around for you. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll make a million mistakes. I'll make the world safe and sound for you. We'll come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. We'll give the world to you, and you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Yeah, you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday.
Somehow the arts have a way of saying things in a way that connects, that we cannot do any other way. And that's why I thought it was really important for us to have the arts lead us in this discussion. And the further discussion is with some of the most outstanding artists, writers of our time. It's essential that we establish and preserve the narrative of January 6th. To do so, we are privileged to have the guidance of leading historians in our nation. Our moderator, Dr. Carla Hayden, is referenced by our distinguished leader, who as Librarian of Congress helps preserve the treasures of American history. We are very, very proud of you, Madam Librarian. She will have the privilege of truly introducing our guest, but I do want to thank Doris Kearns Goodwin, a national treasure, who chronicled some of the most pivotal periods and personalities in American history. We're waiting for Team of Rivals to be made into a musical. Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you for being with us. And John Meacham, whose brilliant writing has informed and inspired millions, and we're grateful to him for the beautiful book he wrote about our colleague, John Lewis. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for informally advising our President of the United States, Joe Biden. Thank you, John Meacham. Their wisdom will serve our Congress and the country, because as we know, As Lincoln told us, and as we just all know, the stories connect, and they will tell the story, the narrative of America and the place that January 6th fits into that. And we will work to preserve the full, true history of that day. With that, I'm very pleased now to invite our guests to the podium and first yield to the Distinguished Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. Stenny and I take special pride in Carla Hayden because she's the librarian from the Baltimore Enoch Pratt Free Library, a leader in the Maryland community of thought. And I, again, was so thrilled when she was named by the President Obama to be the Librarian of Congress, because I know she was a leader in the library community, the head of the whole thing, springing from Baltimore, Maryland, and now the head of the Library of Congress, Carla Hayden. Thank you, Carla.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and Senator Schumer, and all the members of Congress who are here in person and with us online. And as a librarian, a career librarian, who has spent her life working with bringing narratives to people, it is an honor for me to be with two of the leading and most distinguished historians.
Thank you.
I think we should all clap for that one.
Thank you.
This is a librarian's dream and everyone's dream, because you have both written and studied about the narrative of this country and some of the darkest times, some of the times that were triumphant. And as the Madam Speaker quoted from the song from Hamilton, if we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. So I thought, could we travel back in time to the founding of this country? And were they sure? Did they know? What was going on then?
You want me to go? Because being described as a distinguished historian, as Doris and I know, is like being the best restaurant in a hospital. You know, you want to win, but it's not that hard. But we're very grateful, and thank you to Madam Speaker and Senator Schumer. I think they would be surprised that we've come this far. They were incredibly aware of the fragility of democracy. They were aware of the fallibility of humankind. They had a keen awareness of sin and imperfection and appetite and ambition. They knew that the struggle in everyone's soul, which would find full expression in a popular government, was between generosity and greed, and between kindness and cruelty. And the goal of the Constitution was, yes, there were checks and balances in a literal sense, but it was also about curbing our worst instincts, to give, as the speaker quoted earlier, to give our better angels a chance to take flight. Now, Doris is a better person than I am, as is Dr. Hayden, and we won't even get into Pelosi, because she's so much better. But if I get things right 51% of the time, that's a heck of a good day. Why would a popular government be any different? Because a democracy is the manifestation of all of us. So our habits of heart and mind matter enormously. And what you saw a year ago today was the worst instincts of both human nature and American politics, which was the will to power over the idea of equality and the rule of law taking precedence. And without a recognition that this experiment is worth defending, this experiment is in fact, Jefferson called it the world's best hope in his inaugural, President Lincoln called it the last best hope, President Reagan called it the last best hope of man on earth. Without a defense of that idea, and what that idea is that in fact we are all created equal. We are entitled to equal protection of the law, equal dignity, innate dignity. And without defending that idea, then we slip into a state of chaos. And what Doris and I are lucky enough to do is to find examples where those better angels have prevailed. And it's always a close-run thing, right? There's never a landslide for the good guys. There's just not. Moses said, remember the days of old, remember the years of many generations. Ask thy fathers, and they will tell thee, thy elders, and they will show thee. Gospel of St. John said, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make ye free. And what does truth mean in Greek? It means unconcealed. There is a fact, there is a truth, and that when the scales fall from our eyes, there is a reality. And the reality of American life is that we have to defend this experiment.
Doris, you have written about the moment that George Washington at the founding, and he had an opportunity to become a different figure than we know him.
You know, I mean, it's really interesting, I think, when you think about George Washington and what might have happened to this country. All he had to do after the revolution was won was to take power, which many people wanted him to do. There was, in fact, a mutiny before when the soldiers weren't being paid. Hold on a second. And they said to him, you got to take over. We need that. It would have been so easy for him to have a coup, but he didn't. And that's when old George III in Hamilton said, if he really went back to Mount Vernon and resigned his commissionership, which he did, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And that's what he was. And then he becomes president of the United States, and he clearly could have had 3 terms, 4 terms, 5 terms, but he voluntarily decided there was an importance for the peaceful transition of power. And then what does he do? When he leaves us with that farewell address, which gives us such warnings today, which I know they read in the Senate every year, and it just talked about the baneful effects of party strife, which was just beginning to show its head. And he understood that if that happened, and people in different parts of the country began to see each other, not through their mutual affections, but through almost their lust for power and their desire to somehow abuse it at times, then the whole experiment would fall apart. And then I just sometimes think about how you say how we didn't know what we were doing then. When I remember when I was first giving a lecture at Harvard on the presidency, and I found the wonderful quotes about what we might call the president. At one point, it might have been his mightiness, or it could have been his excellency, the protector of their liberties. And then Jefferson, I think, is the one who said, no, it should be Mr. President. And then Adams was apoplectic. There are presidents of garden clubs. There are presidents of Rotary clubs. There'll be no dignity. Without thrones, without dignity, the whole thing will fall apart. But of course, Mr. President, it became. So I think we look back on these things and we know it worked out. I mean, I keep thinking as an historian that the interesting thing is that we know what the people living at the time did not know. We know the revolution was won. We know George Washington became a president, not a military leader. We know that the Civil War ended with emancipation secured and the Union restored. We know that the Allies won World War II, but the people living through that time did not know that. So they're living with the same anxiety we're living through today. How will this fragile democracy, which is under attack today, resolve itself? And I guess the hope that that brings is that we've come through these really tough times before. And the hope is also that we're going to get to write the chapter of our story, just like our ancestors wrote the chapters of those stories. And they did pretty well. They failed us at times, but as you say, even though there's these bad angels, we've had extraordinarily good angels. Even on January 6th, as the speaker said, look at those people, those first responders. Look at the Capitol Police. Look at the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the people in the Civil War. We've had lots of people who were willing to step up and put their public lives against their private lives, and that's what we've got to depend on today. That's what we need in these years and months ahead.
Now, both of you, though, have found some very chilling parallels between the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War, and our situation. So could we go back to that tumultuous decade and share what transpired and what was going on?
Well, the 1850s didn't end well, and so it is a chilling parallel. You had two competing visions of reality. You had two faiths. You had two interpretations of Scripture, both religious Scripture and secular Scripture, the Declaration of Independence. You had violence on the floor of the House. What you did not have was an insurrection, like the one you are commemorating today. On February 14th, 1861, when John Breckinridge, who had lost the presidency along with Stephen Douglas to Abraham Lincoln, was under pressure to decertify the electoral votes, he refused to do so. And Winfield Scott had fortified, and in fact, this experiment in liberty went on exactly 2 more months before Fort Sumter. 8 weeks before Fort Sumter, there was a plot to try to decertify the electoral count. Now, as Mark Twain once said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The issue, I think, about the 1850s heading into that is that you did not have a common story. There was not a sense that we were all devoted to what became the most important sentence ever originally rendered in English, which is that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. An amazing sentence that has changed more lives around the world than any other single sentence. And it was written not in a vacuum, but as part of this remarkable experiment that we were part of and are part of, which was an entire reorientation of reality when you think about it, from popes and princes and prelates and kings who were given authority over all of us. It was a vertical universe. Then what happened? We got Gutenberg. You got to love a conversation where Gutenberg comes up, just as a basic rule.
We nerds bring up
Yeah,
Gutenberg.
exactly. This is like dork porn right now. You've got Gutenberg, the Protestant Reformations, the spread of literacy, the scientific revolution, the Scottish moral enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, an entire shift in the world from being organized this way to being organized this way, where we, in fact, were given the power to determine our own destinies. And the American Revolution, for all of its flaws, was the fullest political manifestation of that shift in reality. That's the idea. That's why soldiers were hitting Omaha Beach. That's what drove the women of Seneca Falls. That's what drove John Lewis and Hosea Williams and so many other people across that bridge. It was that there is an idea worth defending. And if enough of us do not assent to that idea, then madness comes. And the task of any generation, as Doris was saying, the task of any citizenry, the task of any Congress, is to remind people that, in fact, in diversity, there's strength. And it's always a close-run thing. It's not going to be easy. But it has worked before, and it should be able to work now.
Well, I think the chilling thing about the 1850s is when I think of the attack on Senator Sumner, the anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, by Preston Brooks, the South Carolinian congressman, it happened in the Senate, and because of that, it touched, as one historian said, the hearts and minds of the American people in a way lots of other anti-slavery people had been attacked before, but somehow it hit home. And there was a sense in which, for a while, more people joined the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln joined it after that. The moderates and conservatives realized they had to leave the party structure behind. The Whig Party collapsed. And I thought that was going to happen, that a line had been drawn after January 6th in the same way. Because sometimes these events just touch you, and there's a fundamental sense on the part of the people that something had to change. And we got Abraham Lincoln out of that. The sad, scary part of the 1850s is that Preston Brooks became a hero in the South, that the governor presented him with a silver goblet. People are running around with canes wanting to get other members of the anti-slavery movement. They'll get Seward next, they said. And it was part of that partisanship of the 1850s where you had alternative realities. Indeed, one historian said when you saw that event and you saw two alternative narratives, that's when you knew that something was happening to the country. And there is a sense, of course, that there was a partisan press in the 1850s. You know, when Lincoln would be in his debates with Stephen Douglas, and the Republican paper would be reporting on the very same debate that the Democratic Party would be reporting on, when they report on the Lincoln part of it, they say he was so triumphant, he was carried out on the arms of his supporters. You read the Democratic paper, and he fell on the floor. It was so embarrassing that he had to be dragged out by his supporters. So we have some of those parallels from the 1850s, and the only hope will be that, you're right, it ended badly. I mean, obviously it ended badly with the Civil War, but out of that came what had to be done, which was to undo that original sin of slavery. And those people fought for that. We had a leader in Abraham Lincoln who carried us through that. And I think when we look at what happened, that's what you have to remember, that somehow some of these fights have to be fought. But hopefully it doesn't have to end up that way, that we'll know the mistakes we made in the 1850s. You could see the country moving apart. Each one of those events, Kansas, Nebraska, Dred Scott decision, John Brown, it pulled us further and further apart so that there was no talking to one another on either side. We can't let that happen today.
If I may, and we have to incentivize this, right? We can't just preach at people. You have to find a way to make it in their interest to do the right thing. I wish that were different, but it's not. It hasn't been since Eden, you know, not our fault. So how do you do that? And I'd argue that one idea is history itself. What do you want the world to say of you? Do you want to be Bull Connor? Or do you want to be John Robert Lewis? Do you want to be Jefferson Davis? Or do you want to be Abraham Lincoln? Use the power of memory as an incentive, not as a bludgeon, but remind people that when we're at our best, we don't build statues to people who tear down. We build statues to people who create. I sometimes use what I call the portrait test. And I sometimes say when I'm lucky enough to talk to people who hold office, you know, what do you want us to think about when we look at your portrait? And it tends to work because y'all tend to think that people are going to be looking at your portrait, right?
Yeah, now, Doris.
And yours, ma'am. Doris.
Well, there was another time, in the turn of the 20th century. And you've written, Doris, about Teddy Roosevelt. And he was thrust into office after his assassination, President McKinley. And we don't often focus on that, but there were some similarities there.
Yeah, I think in many ways that the turn of the 20th century has more echoes for today than almost any other time. I mean, just think about it. The Industrial Revolution had shaken up the economy, much like globalization and the tech revolution have done today. It was the first time you really had a gap between the rich and the poor. You had people in the country feeling suspicious of all those people in the city. You had a sense of lots of immigrants coming in from abroad and an anti-immigrant philosophy that was developing. You had a whole bunch of new inventions, the telephone and the telegraph, that made some people feel life is moving too fast. We've got to go back to an earlier way of life. And Teddy Roosevelt warned at that time that the real problem for democracy, the threat, would be if people began regarding each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. If people in different sections had a class hatred for one another. So that he saw, I think, what we're feeling today, but what did he do about it? He argued that there should be a fundamental fairness in the country, a square deal for the rich and the poor. I don't know where my voice has gone. I've been talking too much.
Never.
No.
A square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker. And then he went around the country in a train, 6 weeks every spring, 6 weeks every, can you still hear me even if I'm talking like this? I normally have a low voice, but now it's gotten really low. So anyway, 6 weeks in the spring, 6 weeks in the fall, and he gave the same message all across the country. And then as the train would go away, he would stand there waving for hours at people who had just come to see him on the railroad track because he was the president who was trying to get a common American spirit going. And at one point he was waving very frantically at a group and he was getting a rather cold reception. until he was finally told that because of his nearsightedness, he was waving frantically at a herd of cows. No wonder that he didn't get a response. But I think somewhere there's something that we can learn from that, that somehow recreating those feelings. He said that fellow feeling. What is fellow feeling that we have for our fellow American citizens? It's an empathy, it's an understanding, it's the human quality we need to listen to other people, to empathize with people for whom fate may have dealt an unkind hand like for us, and to be able to, in a certain sense, just understand their point of view. And that's what I think we need our leaders to do, to get out of Washington, to get back not only to their own districts, to go to other places. I dream about a public service program, a national service program, where kids from the country could go to kids in the city and spend a year in a common mission that they would be able to fulfill so that they're learning what it's like to live with other people. If there's any way I could feel that that could happen. I know we've got pieces of it in the Teacher Corps, and we've got pieces of it in what was the Peace Corps, but there's something about bringing people from different parts of the country together with a common mission for our country. The military does it. No wonder, I remember reading that 75% of the military, of congressmen and senators in like the 50s and the 60s were members of the military. They knew what it was like to have a common military mission, so they knew what it was like to have a national mission, and little wonder we had bipartisanship in those days. So somehow we've got to figure out a way to listen, to empathize, and that's what old Teddy Roosevelt was able to do pretty well.
Can I say, so, I should also report, Twitter has had a lot of impact on our lives, as we know, but it is the author of one of the greatest things, I think, said in our time, which is that if Mr. Rogers and Doris Goodwin had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And so I want to insist on that and make sure.
He's my son, really, in
sure
fact.
I'm glad you said that.
Make sure Mom's okay. I left my sweater outside. But you know, the speaker talks a lot about narrative and fact, reality. And there's a tendency, a human tendency, to want the past to have been simpler. That's understandable, because our own ambient reality is difficult, because it's our reality, it's the problems of our time. But there was never a once upon a time in American history, and there's not going to be a happily ever after. This is an unfolding job. I don't need to tell you all this, you signed up for it. You put yourselves forward, you put yourself in the arena. You are here to do this, to govern in an imperfect world. And you know that. This country, as we know it right now, is about 56 years old. Bear with me. The first actually integrated national election in American history was 1968, 52 years ago. The Immigration and Nationality Act, signed by President Johnson, and the Civil Rights Act in '64 and the Voting Rights Act in '65 transformed the country. So we are a pretty young nation when you think about the actual electorate. So when you go back there and you realize that in 1968, how did that year go? It began with Tet, which brought Gene McCarthy into the race. It forced Lyndon Johnson out of the race. He gave the speech saying he would not be a candidate on the last Sunday in March in 1968. That same Sunday morning, Martin Luther King preached at the Washington National Cathedral. He quoted Theodore Parker saying, "The arc of a moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." 4 days later, he'd be shot to death outside room 306 at Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The country erupts in riots. 6 weeks after that, Senator Kennedy is killed in Los Angeles. 6 weeks after that, the Chicago Democratic National Convention descends into chaos and violence. And on Election Day, 1968, Richard Nixon wins narrowly over Hubert Humphrey, but George Corley Wallace of Alabama carried 13.5% of the popular vote and 5 states on an explicitly segregationist platform 50 years ago. So let's tap the brakes on nostalgia. 100 years ago, the woman who was second in line to the presidency of the United States could not vote until the 19th Amendment. The Ku Klux Klan was refounded on the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1915 at Stone Mountain, Georgia, as an anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-black, anti-Catholic institution. 2 to 6 million Klansmen joined. There were 30 members of the House who were members of the Klan, about 10 senators. The governors of 5 states were members of the Klan 100 years ago, Georgia and Texas, also Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon, 100 years ago. The governor of Georgia said we need to build a wall of steel as high as heaven to keep immigrants out. And the 1924 Democratic National Convention went to 103 ballots because there were 347 Klan delegates at Madison Square Garden who would not vote for Al Smith to be the nominee because he was Irish Catholic.
I got to take you to a more hopeful moment.
But
wait. You're my son. You're supposed to be.
Sorry, yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Won't you be my mother?
Once you look at, just think, for example, you look at a decade like the 60s, and you know how it ended, as I said before, and you feel sad about that decade. Extraordinary things happened in that decade, right? In the middle of that decade, you take Lyndon Johnson comes into power, the man that I knew very well, and for whom I feel still an enormous respect. And I think historians will accord him the respect that he deserves, despite the war in Vietnam, which will always be a stain on his legacy. He comes into that presidency in the middle of that decade after John Kennedy is killed, and he makes civil rights, the passage of that bill, his first priority. And his advisors say, you can't do that. You can't do that. You only have a certain amount of currency as president, so you can't spend it on this. Then he famously said, and what the hell is the presidency for? And then he somehow, with the civil rights movement having given him the strength to do it, he gets that civil rights bill through the Congress. And that changes the face of America. Segregation is ended legally in the South. And then they think they have to have another year before they can get voting rights because they have to absorb the civil rights thing. And then the Selma demonstrations take place. This is how change takes place in this country. When an outside movement creates the social conscience and changes public sentiment, then the inside channels of power have to mobilize at that moment. That speech that he gave to the joint session of Congress, I was listening to that speech when I was a Harvard student, and there was Lyndon Johnson, who I was in the anti-war movement, who later I would think I could never have been for, and then eventually ended up working for him. There was Lyndon Johnson talking about the fact that he said, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. You know, at times, history and fate meet at a certain time at a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. He understood that what John Lewis and the fellow foot soldiers had done in that bridge by turning their backs against a brutal attack against them, that the consciences of the country had been changed, and it was time to move for that. And then he went on to say that this is not a Negro movement, not a white movement, not a Northern movement, not a Southern movement. It is not a moral challenge because it is simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. And then he went on famously to say, and even if we do that, there's still a long way to go, but if we work together, we shall overcome. The outside movement meets the inside power, and change took place. And at that same time, in those same months, you get Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, NPR, PBS. So we have to remember that in those hard moments, that decade, we look at it and we think, oh my God, it ended the way you said. But in the middle, all of that happened. And I must say, just on a personal note, if I'd ever imagined, as I was listening to that speech with my friends, and we were all in tears by the end of that We Shall Overcome speech, that I'd end up 3 years later working for Lyndon Johnson, or more importantly, that 10 years later, I would meet the man, Richard Goodwin, who crafted those words, and that he would become my husband of 42 years before he died a couple years ago. So that moment means so much to our country. It was the crowning moment of Lyndon Johnson's life, of my husband's life, and I think even though you're absolutely right, my son, in understanding that these things have been really difficult, we have to remember those moments in time when things worked, because otherwise that's our responsibility as historians to tell us where things were tough, but to always tell us how people stood up and we can do it again. Because otherwise, you got to believe we can. We have to believe we can't allow ourselves to not feel that sense of agency that we still have to make these things different, I think.
Absolutely, and the way the 20s ended, with terrible economic depression, but Franklin Roosevelt.
Right, FDR comes along.
Who stands on the, who says on the East Front, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
There's hope in history.
There is hope in history, absolutely. There's also fear, and that's what life is. And we have to remind ourselves, I believe, the story we have to tell ourselves is that we can overcome.
Right, exactly right.
And FDR, because when he came in, it was pretty shaky then, right?
Yeah, and just think about FDR and what he faced when he came in. I mean, he said he was possibly thought in February before March that the whole house of cards might collapse before he could even take the inaugural oath. And somebody said to him, if your new program works, you will be the greatest president in history. If it doesn't work, you'll be the worst president in history. He said, no, if it doesn't work, I'll be the last president in history. That's how fragile things were. And then somehow he gets to that inaugural, and it's not just the fear, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. What he does is to tell the people, this is not your fault, what's happened. It's been a failure of leadership, and I'm here to provide that leadership. I will treat this as if we were at a war against a common enemy. This is what I wished had happened with COVID, that it was a common enemy that we should have been a war against as a whole people. And he said that I will do whatever is necessary to bring jobs to the American people. And that contagion of confidence that he had was so great that all of a sudden there's headlines, we have a leader, the government still lives. But my favorite story is there was hundreds of thousands of letters who were written into Franklin Roosevelt after that. And my favorite came from a man who said, I've lost my job, my wife is mad at me, our roof fell off, my dog ran away, but everything's all right now because you are there. It's the mystery of leadership that somehow when people are ready for common action, he provided that common thing. And then what happens? The banking crisis gets solved. At that point, people couldn't get their money out of the banks. You had people who were hungry with no safety net. You had 1 out of 4 people out of work. You had millions having lost their homes and farms. And yet he started the New Deal going, and eventually things began to develop. And then that's the generation that becomes the greatest generation for World War II. So again, it's one of those moments in history that could have gone in a very different direction. We were lucky enough to have people that were strong enough and resilient enough, and a leader who was able to lead us through. And again, history will tell us we can do it again.
And so, this day, and at this point in time, and as historians, and you have spent your lives, basically, putting the narrative together, moving it along, what do you think about where we are now?
You go first.
We don't know. This is a chapter. It's not the end of the story. And if it is the end of the story, then we have failed in a way as a people that the world will forever condemn. To lose this, as the song says, to lose this gift through selfishness and a greed for power, for an autocratic impulse, would be beyond tragic. I don't believe that's going to happen, but I believe we're as close to that as we have been since Sumter. We have something like, I don't know what the number is, but almost half the country, let's be honest, right? This is about truth. Almost half the country disagrees with a very good bit of everything we've said the past few minutes, right? They think somehow or another this is a partisan undertaking. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm George Bush's biographer, and I try to help Joe Biden. You figure it out. What I believe in is the country, and I believe in this experiment. And I believe it's the best chance we have, as Lincoln said, that we can give everyone an open field and a fair chance for our industry, intelligence, and enterprise. January 6th is it's not a wake-up call. That's not quite the right way to put it. It is, as the president says, it's an inflection point. And it's either a step on the way to the abyss, or it is a call to arms, figuratively, for citizens to engage and say, no, we are more important. The work we are about is more important than the will and the whim of a single man or a single party or a single interest.
And I think that's what the Select Committee is so important about right now. We have to retell the story of what happened on January 6th with all of the gaps filled in. And again, I just have a fundamental belief that if that story is told in its fullest, as I think it will be in these weeks and months ahead, as we get more information, as we get more testimony, as the public hearings are beginning to be held, that we can retell it in the way of what really happened. And I do believe that a line will be drawn, that maybe it's 50-50 now, maybe it gets to be 55-45, maybe it gets to be 57 more, that if more people can be persuaded that this cannot happen again, and that what happened not only to prevent it from happening again, but to deal with what's going on in the country that made this possible to happen, we've got to somehow believe in the fundamental fairness of the country. They came through before. Look at where we stood in 1940. This is what really gives me hope in a certain sense. When you think about what Hitler was doing, marching through Western Europe in the space of a week, and then in a couple more weeks, France falls as well. America stood only 18th in military power at that time. We became 17th when Holland surrendered to Germany. And yet somehow there was isolationism in the country. There was a real worry. Would we be able to stand up to what fascism represented? Democracy was too slow. We were too soft. And yet once that challenge was really there, we met it. And I think about what happened is, you know, Democrats came together with Republicans. Business came together with the government in a way that they'd been fighting during the end of the New Deal. We were able to produce a plane every 4 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes, a ship every single day. We did that, we can do that again. There just has to be that sense of what you're saying. There has to be a belief of where we're going right now. This is, in my lifetime, this is the hardest moment for democracy. It may not be in the country, it may not be as bad as it was in 33, it may not be as bad as it was in 61, in 1861, or in 1940, but it's the hardest thing in my long lifetime. So we have to recognize how deep that challenge is and not sugarcoat it. That's one of the things Lincoln would say. Yeah. But on the other hand, recognizing it and knowing that we've got another chance now to retell this story of January 6th, and not just what happened, but what we need to have happen from now on. I think it's giving us a chance again that we had last year. We didn't take advantage of it because somehow the alternative narrative got developed. But I think it can come back again because it's there. It's the truth, as you're saying.
And I just want to say thank you to all of you because you're standing in the breach at democracy's hour of maximum danger. And democracy is incredibly counterintuitive. Look, if this were easy, the whole world would be doing it, right? This is incredibly difficult. And yet, no more important words in American history than "and yet."
There is hope. I think there's hope in the young people. Just think about how many people voted in this last election. Think about how many more women have gotten into politics than ever before. And maybe that's what you as politicians who are here, believing in the vocation of politics, spreading that word among young people. We have to get young people to trust in government again. We've got to get people at local, state, and national level to begin to feel a sense that they can actively influence what's happening. And you guys are doing it already, you women and men. And somehow, I think if we can just make young people feel again, which I think they're beginning to feel, they care about the environment at a deep level, they've been active at local levels, and I think we've got to look to that younger generation, those of us who are older, to carry forth that belief that politics, I still think it's the greatest vocation. I think, I look back on the people who've chosen to make public life over their private lives in a certain sense. There's a great honor in that. You should be proud of it. I agree with what John's saying. And we just have to spread that word among other people and get more people involved in politics. At a very time when it may seem like the last thing they want to do, it's up to us to tell them, we as historians, you as the activists, how extraordinary a career it is. You know what it's like to feel this way, and I think we should honor that.
Churchill once said that the future's unknowable, but the past should give us hope. It's just the present we have to get through.
You're giving us hope.
And he was sure how he would be remembered by history because he was going to write it.
That's right, that's right, that's right.
But I think if I could just add one more thing, I think when you were talking before about what people should be thinking about their own portraits, what you really hope for people in politics or people in any field is that the ambition for self becomes an ambition for something larger. And I don't know when that happens in a person. It sometimes happens young. It did with Abraham Lincoln.
Usually after the portrait is hung.
That's too late. But I think with Abraham Lincoln, it happened when he was 23, the first time he ran for office. And he was talking about the fact that he had a peculiar ambition to somehow be able to perform something that could be remembered by other people, that he could be valued for, having made a difference in people's lives. Sometimes for Lyndon Johnson, it happened later, when he had an almost fatal heart attack in the 1950s and was on his bed and was not sure about whether he was going to live, was so depressed they couldn't get him to mobilize. And all of a sudden, one day he woke up and he said, I've got to get shaved, I'm back. And they said, well, what brought you back? He said, I was lying here thinking, suppose I died now, what would I be remembered for? And then he went for civil rights in the Senate, and then he went for civil rights as a president. And I think that matters when that turn takes place. And we just got to hope in young people that they understand that it's not just the ambition for yourself, that it's an ambition for something larger, and then we can feel a part of a common good.
And he also worked with, and you mentioned it before, with the civil rights movement. I mean, and that can happen with the movements and working together.
Well, that's the way history happens when the voices of the many attract the attention of the powerful few. I mean, you all know that in your lives.
No, exactly right. I mean, when Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, don't call me a liberator. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all. All that change always comes from the ground up. I mean, the progressive movement was in the cities and states before Teddy Roosevelt comes into power. The Settlement House movement, the civil rights movement is there before Lyndon Johnson, and the women's movement and the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. So again, that's where we have to just hope that that arousal of citizen involvement can then begin to push us to do something at the federal level.
I think one of the key points in a democracy, and I think this is 250 years of our history and also in various other countries, you all tend to be far more mirrors of who the country is as much as makers, right? I mean, that's what a popular government is. This goes to Edmund Burke. You owe us not just a reflection of the will of the people, but your best judgment. But that's a very interesting and fluid dynamic. And that's why this is not just on you. It's on all of us. And to keep playing the pronoun out for a second, it's why it can't just be about him. This is about our future, and all of us have a responsibility to remember that a more perfect union is about we the people, not about a single person.
To the audience and everyone with us today, all three of us are wearing something. Doris and I were wearing pins, and John's case, cufflinks.
Right. I was going to wear a pin, but Doris wouldn't let me.
It's an inscription that was in President Lincoln's, and I'm from Illinois, so that rings really something, in his custom-made top coat.
Brooks Brothers.
And he wore it a lot, as Doris says, a team of rivals. And he was wearing it the night he was assassinated. And it said, "One country, one destiny." encapsulates it all. Now, John, you also had something to say about your cufflinks.
Well, yeah, I'm not wearing the specific ones. I'm wearing these because they're George Herbert Walker Bush. And I thought, particularly since we're in the House side, the gentleman from the 7th District of Texas from 1966 to 1970, who is a great example, I think, of everything we're talking about here. Someone who opposed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 when he was running for the Senate in Texas, but in 1968, when he was here, voted for fair housing. And I think in an interesting way represents the best part of politics, which was that it mattered to him what he did with power once he had it. And he was an imperfect man who left us a more perfect union. And I don't want to drag you all into my imperfection, but we are an imperfect citizenry, and our task has to be that more perfect union.
One country, one destiny. So we will end on a note of hope. Is the foundation holding?
If you stand watch, we'll be good. It's because of all you all. I mean, you're standing in the breach. This is incredibly difficult. This is a battle, not the war. It's a chapter, not the story. So, God bless you.
Thank all of you.
Ma'am.
Yes, sir.
My colleagues, let's join in thanking Dr. Hayden, Doris Goodwin, and John Meacham for an extraordinary, powerful conversation, and to all of you for your work to protect democracy. Soon, my colleagues will begin this next portion of our session, member testimonials. Before we do, though, I just want to address Dr. Hayden's last question about one country, one destiny. You know, you've heard me say of this pin, it says one country, one destiny on it. And Doris has on that pin, as does Carla. I gave John the male version of it, cufflinks, but he has cufflinks from George Herbert Walker Bush, so we'll defer to that. One Country, One Destiny was embroidered in the coat that Abraham Lincoln had the night he was assassinated. Probably a coat he wore every day, but it was close to his heart. One country, one destiny. It was very much a part what was in his head for our country. I think we have to follow his lead in so many ways, including bringing our country together. Soon we'll hear the second portion of the session, our members' testimonials, which are very valued by all of us, and we look forward to it. Along with the historian's perspective, the voices of members are an essential piece of the narrative of January 6th. Today, led by Congressman Crow, we will hear reflections from our colleagues. I thank Congressman Crow for organizing that. We thank them, all of our members, for their courage in sharing their experiences and sharing their truth of that day. Now, though, before our members' testimonial, let us close this conversation with this presentation.
It is a momentous day in Washington, and all eyes are on the nation's capital.
We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. Yeah!
The House will be in order.
When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do.
Madam Speaker and members of Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session to verify the certificates and count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States.
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
In 13 hours, Capitol has been breached. And be advised they're attempting to break a window on the east front.
We'll stand in recess until the call of the chair.
Without objection, the House is going to go back into recess.
In your seats, please grab a mask, place it in your lap, and be prepared to don your mask in the event that we get a breach.
We were just told that there has been tear gas in the rotunda, and we're being instructed to each of us get a gas mask.
Some protesters have made it inside the Capitol building and are gathering where the Senate was in session.
Nancy! Where are you, Nancy?
Stop the steal! Stop the steal! We're outnumbered. There's a fucking million of us out there, and we are listening to Trump. You're the boss. Here we go, Nancy!
Check this out. We are inside Nancy Pelosi's office, and I told you they're going. They're going.
You're supposed to protect the Constitution. You're a traitor. No, if you go against the yes.
Stay down. Get down.
That's what we fucking need to have 30,000 guns up here.
That's true.
There's a picture. We lost the line. We lost the line. LMPD, get back.
of Donald Trump will be locked for 12 hours following the removal of the tweets that Twitter deemed incite violence.
Today was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol. But thanks to the swift efforts of U.S. Capitol Police, federal, state, and local law enforcement, the violence was quelled. The Capitol is secured, and the people's work continues.
President Franklin Roosevelt set aside December 7, 1941, as a day that will live in infamy. Unfortunately, we can now add January 6, 2021, to that very short list of dates in American history that will live forever in infamy.
Our purpose will be accomplished. We must and we will show to the country, and indeed to the world, that we will not be diverted from our duty, that we will respect our responsibility to the Constitution and to the American people.
The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. 117th Congress, the chair declares the joint session dissolved.